Welcome to Lesson 13 in the C# from Start to Finish course. My name is Tim Corey, and today we're going to continue to work on our Create Team form. In our last video, we wired up the Add New Member section of our form. In this video, we're going to wire up our drop-down and our list box, as well as taking the Add New Member section, taking that object we created, that new person, and adding them to our list box as well. So that's the plan for this video. Now let's get started. Over here we have our form. Here's our drop-down, and here is our list box. Now if you've seen my previous videos where I've wired up forms before, you know that behind this combo box and behind this list box, I'll have a list of, in this case, list of person. And for each of these, it's going to be a list of person. So let's go ahead and create those. This is my code behind. I hit F7. You can also come down here, right-click on your Create Team form, and say View Code. That works as well. Now, at the class level, not inside of my constructor or inside any of my methods, I'm going to create a private list of person and call this available team members. Equals new list of person, private list, it's actually person model, but person's fine. Selected team members equals new list of person model. So what's going to happen over here is we'll have all the people that are available that could be on this team in this dropdown. We're going to select one, hit Add Member, and they come over here into this list box. Now if you decide I want to add a new team member directly, you can create the new person, that'll create them, and then take that object and put it directly into this list. The next time we open up this form, that newly created person will now be in this dropdown. One other thing to note is you might be thinking, well, I could limit this so that the second team I create doesn't have those team members available to it. So this combo box can get smaller and smaller. And you could probably, maybe, kind of. The problem with that is this Create Team form is not directly tied to a tournament. Now, in our system, a tournament kicks off this form, but let's think this thing through. We can have more than one tournament going on at a time. So if we had a basketball tournament and a ping pong tournament, wouldn't I be available to be on a team for both? Therefore, be on two different teams. So it would get really complex to try and figure out how to limit this combo box to only people who are available to be on a team. Let's think worst case scenario for a minute. What if you had a ping pong doubles tournament? And so you had 2 people per team. And in the office you have 7 people. Well, ideal would be 8. So maybe one person does double duty and it's on 2 different teams. That's a possibility. So instead of trying to do all this crazy logic to limit this combo box, we're going to leave it alone. The only limiting we'll do is if we have added a person to this list, they won't be in this dropdown. That's the only limitation we'll do, which actually makes our job easier. Okay, so we have these 2 lists. The available will go over here, and the selected will go over here. So that's our 2 lists. Now let's create a method that wires these lists up. I'm going to create a method called private void wire up lists. And what this will do is it will wire up our dropdown or combo box and our list box to our list. So we can say, let's get the name of the dropdown. The dropdown is, here's the properties. It's select team member dropdown. select team member dropdown dot data source equals available team member. Now we didn't used to be able to do this. We used to have to create a binding source between our dropdown and our list because the dropdown didn't know how to deal with a list directly. We don't anymore, which is great. That makes life a little easier. The other thing we need to do is look at our display member. Now our display member is a string, but that string represents one property inside of your, in this case, person model. So let's look at the person model and see which property do you want to pull over that represents the person. And I don't see one. I mean, we have first name, that's great until you have two Tims. Then it's a problem. And last name is great except when you have two Smiths. We could do return $, double quotes, semicolon, inside semiquote, or the double quotes. We'll do first name, then a space, then more curly braces, last name. Now we could return last name, comma, first name if you wanted to. If so, I'd probably call this full name reversed or full name last first. You know, some way of indicating that it's the full name, but it's got the last name first. But I think we're fine with doing the full name as it is. So I'm going to copy this. Normally we don't copy and paste very much inside of code because that's where your bugs come in, when you copy and paste and forget to change all the different areas that need to change. But in this case, I really highly recommend it because we have to put this name inside of double quotes. And that means there's no IntelliSense. There's nothing saying that's not right or that is right. Even if I type this wrong, it wouldn't tell me that until runtime. And in fact, runtime, it wouldn't really tell me that. It would just give me a weird value in my list box or comma box. So I copy and paste there. So that's our select team member dropdown. And then we have this team members list box. So team members list box dot data source equals selected team members. And then the team member list box dot display member is going to equal full name as well. And again, I'm going to paste that in there. So both will have full name. Now let's call this inside of our constructor. There we go. And before we go any further, I'm actually going to create one more method. Private void create sample data. And what I do with this is I create a sample couple of records that I then add to my different lists. That way I can make sure the lists are working the way they're supposed to. So let's say available team members.add new person model, curly braces. I'll put my semicolon at the end first and come back. And say first name equals Tim, last name equals Corey. Now I don't need to fill in the other fields because this is sample data and I'm only displaying just the first and last name. All right. And now I'll also do selected team members dot add, new person model. Same thing, put our curly braces, put the semicolon at the end, come back. I'll copy that and paste it again, and Jones. There we go. And I'll put this method before the wire up lists in my constructor. So I'm going to add 2 records to each of my lists and then wire up a list to the data sources of the dropdown and the list box. Why is that important? Well, if we start this, once it starts, you'll see that I have sample data in both lists. Here's the dropdown with Tim, Corey, and Sue Storm. And here is the list box with Jane Smith and Bill Jones. So both are working as they should. And now we can start working on putting actual data in here and then moving data around once we start wiring up these add member button, delete selected, and even tap into what this button is doing. So that works. So now I can actually get rid of the create sample data just by commenting it out. And the reason I do that is because I might want to come back later and put that in for testing purposes. And it really is a matter of uncomment, and that's it. The great thing about the compiler is if I were to send this code to production, this create sample data is never used, and it will not really do anything to my application to make it run slow or anything like that. It's just kind of there. So now let's wire up actual data collection here, or at least data display from our database or our text file. And how do we do that? Well, we need to come over here to our iData connector. And in here, I'm going to create a new rule or a new item in our contract. I'm going to say it's going to be a list of person model. I'm going to call this get person underscore all. That sounds a little bit weird, but what I'm saying is I want to get, not people, I'm going to say get person because that's the model, the person model over here. Get person all, just like create person. So my schema or my naming convention is going to be create for any kind of insert statement, get for any type of select statement where I'm getting records back. Now I don't need to pass anything in because we're getting all the people, and therefore that's all we need for our contract. Now let's come over to SQL and say, well, you're not currently implementing, so control dot, implement the interface. We can scroll down here and see that we have this right here. So now we can say using IDB connection. Connection equals new system.data.sql client.sql connection global config.cnn string tournaments. I'll put one more at the end of that. We hit enter, and now inside here we can actually call our store procedure, which is over here. We have it already created. It's the people get all. So if I run this, oops, dbo.sp people get all. And right now we have one person in our database. That's Tim Corey. And that's from our previous example where we were writing to SQL to test to make sure that the form worked. So that's all the people we have, and that's okay. We're going to call this stored procedure. Now before I call that, I'm actually going to create an output variable, a list of person model output. I'm not going to initialize it. Instead, I'll say output equals connection.query. This will be a person model. And then I will say, here is the store procedure. And that's really it. Dot to list. That converts it to a list from IEnumerable. And then at the very bottom here, we can return output. Now, you may be looking at that and saying, I can make this simpler. Take away this, and take away this, and just say here, return. Return this call. And yes, that is true, that is simpler, but here's the caveat to this. If I have any kind of issue where I want to debug, catching this before it returns the value can be tricky, especially if you have just a return statement here. Now with this way, I could put my breakpoint right here, right after this is loaded, and then inspect this variable. It makes it a little easier for debugging. So I'm going to leave it that way so I have it in place for debugging. After I'm kind of comfortable with it, I might return it back to just a return, but I probably won't, because down the road, when I need to debug something, I don't want to have to rewrite code in order to debug. So I'll probably leave it that way. And that's something you're going to need to think through on your own. Is this way I'm going to do it or not? And that's really up to you. Okay, so we have this list of persons getting returned when we call the getPerson_all. And just so we don't have any problems here with compile time, I'm going to do my control dot and implement the interface, but notice it has that throw new not implemented exception, which is great because I don't want to implement it yet. One other thing to note is now that I've started to fill this in and I have more items in here, I'm starting to notice a repetition. This magic string tournaments. I'll want to fix that. And so let's actually just do. So if you're repeating yourself, figure out if you can do something different to make that a little easier or a little better. Okay, so we can come back over to our form here. And now instead of create sample data, I'm going to have a method that says private void load list data. And here, I'm going to start by calling the global config dot connection dot, and then right down here we have get person underscore all. And I will put this in the available team members. Now I could put this directly in here, and I might do that. It seems like it's a waste to create this method to do what's already been done, and it's also kind of a waste to have an initialization that then gets overwritten by this. So let's do that. Let's make it a little cleaner and do it just like that. So that's the available team members list. We can get rid of this. And notice nothing happens to the selected team members. And that's intentional because we don't need to change anything in that list. It should be empty to start with. We don't have anyone in the team to start with. Now if we run this form just as it is, let's make sure that we are in fact running from SQL. We're not. So let's change that to SQL. And now we can run it. And now if you notice, we have just Tim Corey as the selected team member, or all the team members in this list consist of just me. If we wanted to, we could add a new person, but it won't add anywhere yet. And instead of doing that now, let's do that once we've wired up where this goes. But first, I want to wire up what happens when we hit the Add Member button. I want to take the person from this list, remove them from this list, add them to this list, and then refresh both. So let's create our event for our button. I'll just double click this time. And there's our button event. And so the button event's job is going to be to take the person out of this list, put them into this list, and then refresh. So how do we know who's in that first list? Well, we're going to say person model P equals select team member dropdown dot selected item. Now that won't work until we cast it. We have to cast it to person model. And essentially what we're saying here is this normally is an object. If you notice, it says object right here for the type, but we said, no, it's not an object. We know that, well, everything's a base object, but this is more specifically a person model. Now, what'll happen is C# will say, okay, I'll trust you, and I will say, yes, this is a person model. And we'll take the selected item and try and shoehorn it into a person model variable. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't, it will blow up. But since we were the ones that filled in this dropdown with a list of person model, we know that's correct. So we're okay in this case. Now that we know who's been selected, we can say available team members dot remove, and that takes in a person model. It's going to find that person and remove them from the available team members list. That's P. Selected team members, and it's not selected. Our list is, selected team members. So selected team members dot add P. So I've taken this person, I've found out who they are, what the actual person object is. I've removed them from the available team members list, and I've added them to the selected team members list. Now remember the way object instances work. We're not making copies here. We have taken the blueprint of the person model class and we've created a house. And we've said, okay, here is this house. It's at 123 Sesame Street. And so when I say find which one is selected, it's essentially saying the house at 123 Sesame Street has been selected. So when I say remove the object at 123 ordered by or has a where clause in it, something like that, then I have my data source list. And so what I can do is I can actually do that limitation here. And every time any kind of data changes, like down here, it'll refresh that list. Now let's see this in action. We can only do it once, but that's okay. We have Tim Corey in the list. We hit add member. Nothing seems to happen. And so let's find out why. That's a great opportunity for us to debug when something we think should happen doesn't happen. What do we do? And so let's come down here and put our breakpoint in our event. I'm going to say add member. And it's going to say get the selected item. I'm going to isn't actually refreshing our data source since it's the same list. Now we can play around with something like select team member dropdown dot refresh and see if that works. And actually I'm going to take this, I cut it, I'm going to move it down here. Instead of wiring up the lists again, I'm going to do this instead. And this is a great time to debug. There we go. This is a great time to debug because we can learn a little bit more about how things are actually working and how to track down a problem. Because here's the deal. So far, my application has just kind of worked. And that really doesn't happen out of the gate that often, at least until you're well down the road of being a programmer. And even then, that's pretty much a rarity. I typically spend half my day debugging why my awesome logic didn't work. And so debugging skills are really important, and they also help you learn. Because as you track down problems, you may even find a bug in how C# works. Now, here's the deal with that. Don't assume that it's a bug in C# until you've eliminated everything else. I mean, everything else. Because 99% of the time, it's your bug. So in this case, let's do a refresh instead of rebinding these lists and see what happens. So I have Tim Corey selected. I hit add member and nope, that didn't do it. So I read about, and this is one of those Googling things, I read about a solution that seems a little wonky, but it was suggested as this is the way to do things. Take the drop down and say data source equals null. And then down here, data source equals null. So you set it to null first and then your list, and that should work every time because it changes that list and it forces a refresh. Let's just see what happens. Add member. Now he's over here and not over here. And that worked. So it worked the first time because it displayed Tim Corey over here, and it worked the second time when I hit add member and it moved him over. So that seems to work. So our solution, at least we found so far that works, is to set this to null first. Does that hurt anything? Probably not, but it would possibly trigger some event loops to happen, but we're going to have that anyways. For example, the selected item is going to change. Well, that's because that's going to be happening anyways, because Tim is going to move from here to over here. Therefore, the selected item over here will change. So that's going to happen anyways. Do we like this solution? It's not the best. Do I have a better solution for it? Not at this time. And so what I might do is I might put a to-do in here that just says, hey, when you get a chance, or a low priority to-do, when you get a chance, why don't you look into if it's a better way to do refreshing of a data binding. So, but otherwise, it works, and it's not terribly inefficient. Therefore, we'll leave it as complete. So now we have this wired up, we have this wired up, and we have this button wired up. We have a couple more to wire up. We have the delete selected, which is probably misnamed. That should probably be remove selected. In fact, let's go ahead and change that now. And also change the name up here. That way, everything is set before I create an event. So remove selected takes the person from this list and puts them back over here. So let's create that event. So it really is the same pattern, and I'll copy and paste here, but I have to remember to change things. The drop down is actually the team's member list box. So instead of being the select team member drop down, it's the team members list box. So whoever's selected in there, pull them over, and then we'll do the opposite of right here. We're going to say selected team members dot remove p and available team members dot add p, and then wire up the lists again. Let's test that out. So we have Tim over here, we add him, we select him, we remove him, and now he's back. If we fire this off, nothing happens because we don't have anything selected. But notice I just broke my code. What just happened? Well, we found a bug in our code in that if no one's selected, weird things happen. So let's start this again. Get a fresh set here, and we're going to pause it on removing the selected person. So add Tim, that's cool. Don't select him, hit remove. The selected item is null. If we step over it, we now have a null person model. Well, we're going to remove null from the selected team, I guess. We're going to add null to our available team. Yep, that's kind of ugly. So now we still have Tim in the selected, and the available we now have one that is null. We continue, select Tim and say remove selected. It knows we've selected one. We skip over that, and it says that person is Tim. We remove Tim from the selected team members list. Now it has 0. We add him to the available team members list. It now has 2, the null and Tim. And wire up the list. And it looks like these are both blank, but if I drop this down, here, right click and say surround with if P does not equal null. All right, so there's our 2 checks, one for each of our buttons. Let's see if they work. We can't unselect Tim. He's already selected. But if we don't select anything here, we hit remove. We do Tim, he goes back over the list. So it looks like there's only one entry here, even if we hit the remove selected without selecting Tim. All right, so that's a bug fix already out of the gate. And that's one thing you want to do when you're creating this type of thing, where you're wiring up a form. You want to try the things that might break it. It always amazes me the things that users do just without thinking that are really awful. They do things that you're like, why would you ever do that? And so instead of reinventing the user, which we can't do even though we can fantasize about it, instead we have to reinvent our application to handle these users. Therefore, we have to try things that are just wacky, like not filling anything out and hitting create team or create member or remove selected, and what happens. So try those things out. As you come across them in your code, fix them, and if you can, have some really good testers test your application with the eye towards breaking it. Because you don't want testers who are all nice and follow all the rules, which some testers can be very conscientious to do. You actually want testers who are rebels, who say, nope, I'm going to break this thing and try every different way to break it. And that's really good for your testing experience, because you'll see what users will do when your application is in production. All right, so we've wired up our lists, both our dropdown and our list box. We've wired up the add member button. We've wired up the remove selected button. Now let's modify this button so it adds a person to this list. To do that, let's just double click on this button. There's already an event created, so it just takes me to that code, which is really convenient. So we already have this person model P, which gets created and updated. And in fact, we can actually say P equals globalconfig.connection.createPerson. That way we capture back the ID as well. And before we wipe out the values, or after, it doesn't really matter, but let's do before, we're essentially going to put them into, it's actually down here, we're going to put them into the selected team member and do the wire up. I'm going to copy this. So we can do all the different iterations and test things out, but essentially everything we've started out to do is now wired up. We can add a member, remove a member, create a member, and it all works correctly with all these different, the drop down the list. The last thing we're going to do is going to be for the next video, and that is to actually create our team. This is a little bit more complicated in the fact that we're going to have to save a couple different pieces of information into our database or text file. So we're going to do that next, but before we go, there's one thing we haven't done yet. I wouldn't find that out, unless we remember, until we did this. If we do this, we're going to get this error right here. Not implemented exception was unhandled. So what happened? Well, what happened is we didn't implement the getPerson_all method. So let's do that. Let's implement that method. And you're going to love this because it's going to kind of blow your mind, I think, how easy this is. Return people file dot full file path dot load file dot convert to person models. Guess what I just did? I just implemented that getPerson_all. How did I know what to type right here? Well, it's actually right here. I just read it. Because whenever we save a person or insert a person into our text file, we first read all the people out of that text file. So how do we get all the people out of that text file? That right there. Therefore, we just put that line down here. I did the direct return instead of creating the output variable. Like I said, for testing purposes, that might be a little more difficult to test, but that's okay. In this case, I'm just going to leave it as it is. If I need to test it later, I'll work on changing that. But now, if we hit start, no error, and we have Joe Smith and Sue Storm in our list. Don't get confused, Sue Storm is not from the database we just created. Instead, I created Sue Storm in my text file as well. And just to show, we can say Bob Smith, Bob at smithy.com, and cell phone is 555-7756. There's Bob Smith. We can also remove Bob Smith. There we go. And now if we close this out, start it up again, we will see that Joe Smith and his brother Bob are both in the list because we added Bob the last time. So, implementing text files, not a big deal. So now our part 2 is complete. So we have these are all implemented right here. We just need to implement this button, create team, which takes in the team name and all the other data we created and creates a team out of it. And that's for the next video. So make sure you stay tuned for that.